Hi, I'm John Clayton, Executive Director of the Manchester Historic Association, and we want to welcome you to this walking tour of pre-Civil War Manchester. We have two great tour guides in Dick Duckoff and John Jordan, fabulous historians, individually but better collectively, and they'll tell you how some of the great barons of Manchester industry got their start in what was then the center of Manchester, here in pre-Civil War Manchester. We are a nonprofit institution. We receive no city, state, or federal funding, so if you would like to become a member, we have brochures we're happy to share with you. But again, most of all, please enjoy this pre-Civil War walking tour of Manchester, New Hampshire. We're going to have to gather really close because I don't think the microphone's going to work today. So again, we're about to do a pre-Civil War walking tour of Manchester with two fabulous tour guides, Dick Duckoff, who is on our board of directors, and John Jordan. I have several other board members here I'd like to introduce, but we'll do that later in the program. If you are not a member of the Manchester Historic Association, we would love for you to become one. The cost is $25 for seniors. Seniors, anybody? For an annual membership, which is unlimited visits to the Mill Yard Museum. We hope you take advantage of that, but most importantly, we hope you take advantage of the knowledge and the research that Dick and John have done in putting this program together. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Dick for a quick intro, and then John Jordan will take over from there. Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I turned the volume up. If my voice gets short-circuited, I'll check my batteries. My name is Dick Duckoff, and I'm doing this tour with John Jordan. We've done many tours before. I think what motivated us on this tour was the fact that this tour had never been done before. The earliest that we had ever done a tour was Victorian Manchester, starting about with homes in the 1870s and 80s, and then we did with the 20th century in the North End, but we never ever did this. And the more we got into it, the more fascinating it was. And to start off with, it's fitting that the brick building just opposite us was built in 1841, the same year that matters came to a head politically between the residents of Old Dairyfield, its government centered on Mammoth Road, near the burial ground there, and the New Village. This term, New Village, was commonly used. Its inhabitants were clustered near the mills and a few blocks on Elm Street and near Elm Street. And they were regarded as newcomers and interlopers. Mutual jealousies arose. The newcomers intended to control the affairs of the town. A stormy town meeting in 1840 was the result of nominees for town officers being stacked with all newcomers, all from the New Village. It took the appointment of 30 constables to maintain order. The votes were counted, and the New Villagers had prevailed. The first town meeting in the New Village was held on February 1st, 1841, and it was voted to build a town hall the following summer at the site of today's City Hall. But the comments of John Stark, Esquire, known as Justice Stark, the son of the general, were long remembered. He raised his voice to speak the following words: "Who are ye that are here to act, and to tread upon us in this manner? I'll tell ye who ye are. You're a set of interlopers, come here to make a living upon the sandbank. And a damn poor living you'll get, let me tell you." All right. In today's tour, we will see that this prophecy rang hollow. The sandbank was to become a thriving city. The 25 years between the ambuscade's first auction of lots and the Civil War was when the real birth of the city took place. John Jordan and I wish to thank the Manchester Historic Association for their help in our research and for their promotion of this first-time ever tour. We hope that you enjoy this walking tour and come away from it with memories of the atmosphere of a neighborhood that was at the time an elegant, prestigious residential district.
The old high school building. Can you hear me? No. You hear me all right? No. No? The building directly across the street, which is the old high school building at 80 Lowell Street. Erected in 1841, this is the oldest school building still standing in Manchester today. It was originally built as a grammar school. It became a high school on March 30th, 1846. It remained that way until the new school was built in 1867. David Perkins, the first male teacher in Manchester, served as its first principal. To punish an unruly student, he used a stout strap. In 1869, Catholics were allowed use of the building. The Sisters of Mercy taught 150 boys here. For many years, it was used as a high school administration building until 1985. The building was now moved by the Hampshire Institute of Arts to the present site. It was back on the lot at one time. And we'll move up. We're going to do this yellow building.
Isaac Riddle, 98 Lowell Street. This house was built in 1844. Isaac Riddle was one of the three sons who, with their fathers, founded in 1817 the firm of Isaac Riddle and Sons, with stores in Piscataqua Village, Bedford, Merrimack, and Boston. They owned sawmills and grist mills and made a large lumbering business from their extensive holdings of woodlands. His father, also named Isaac, superintended the building of the Union Locks and Canals, a vital link in the chain of canals that connected Concord to Boston. In company with Major Caleb Stark, he built and owned the first canal boat ever floated on their waters of the Merrimack. It was named the Experiment. Was built at Bedford Center and drawn 3 miles on wheels by 40 yoke of oxen to a landing on the river, where it was loaded, launched, and sailed to Boston. The following notice was taken from the Boston Sentinel. Can you hear me, by the way? Okay, good. Of 1813. Quote, arrived from Bedford, New Hampshire, canal boat Experiment. Isaac Riddle, captain, via Merrimack River and Middlesex Canal. End quote. Upon her arrival in Boston, she was received with cheers and the firing of cannon. The Riddles became one of the first proprietors of navigation on the Merrimack River. This came to an end in the 1840s with the advent of the railroad. Isaac Riddle was also an important early investor in commercial property in downtown Manchester. Thank you.
We're going to move up in front of the grade.
This fit? How do you do that? You just do it. Pine and Lowell Street. The first Episcopal service ever held in Manchester was held July 11th, 1841, in the brick schoolhouse at the corner of Lowell and Chestnut Street. The first church on the site was completed in 1843 and described as barn-like and was named St. Michael's. The building that stands here today was begun in June of 1860 and consecrated in December of 1860. In June of 1862, the name of the church was changed from St. Michael's to Grace Episcopal Church. In 1913, the new parish house, the gift of Josiah Carpenter and his wife in memory of their daughter Georgia Jerish, okay, was completed. Okay, we'll follow him. Well, don't wait a minute. There we go. Thank you. Okay.
The house just opposite us, the law firm, was built in 1843 by Daniel Clark, one of Manchester's and New Hampshire's most eminent and least studied early leaders. He was born in Stratham, graduated from Dartmouth with first honors in 1834. He was admitted to the bar in Exeter, practiced with the son of a former governor, Judge Bell, and came to Manchester in 1839. In just a few years, he was city solicitor, the first chief of the fire department, and as well, he was an original member of Manchester's Athenaeum and a city library. He was made a member of Manchester Savings Bank, when it was chartered in 1846 as a director. He served in both of those positions until his death in 1891. But on a national level is where his memory, his reputation was really established. He proved himself a master politician. He changed his party label from Whig to Republican in 1856 after serving 5 terms in the state legislature. The very same Judge Bell with whom he had served practicing law in Exeter ran for the U.S. Senate and defeated him. But 2 years later, Judge Bell died. There was a special election, and Daniel Clark won and became U.S. Senator in 1857. And he served right through the Civil War, was a confidant of Abraham Lincoln, and he fervently opposed slavery. In 1864, he supported a constitutional amendment to abolish it. He spoke with these words, quote, "To restore this union with slavery in it, when we have subdued the rebel armies, would be again to build your house on its smoking ruins, when you had not put out this fire which burned it down." And Daniel Clark was so highly regarded that he was appointed President Pro Tem of the Senate during the frequent absences of Vice President Hamlin from Washington, who was bored with the vice presidency and couldn't be bothered, and basically went fishing. Even more importantly, shortly after the beginning of the Civil War, he drafted a resolution declaring Southern senators guilty of conspiracy against the government. Of the 22 senators who had voted to withdraw from the Union, 10 chose to remain as a thorn in Lincoln's side. On July 4th, 1861, with active warfare in progress, Daniel Clark's resolution was quickly passed on the floor of the Senate, thus expelling the 10 remaining Southern senators by a vote of 32 to 10. The 10 being the ones that obviously wanted to stay. I thought you'd figure that out. The final chapter in the remarkable career of Daniel Clark began when he resigned his Senate seat in 1866 to accept the position of federal U.S. District Court judge, which he held until his death in 1891. In fairness to his critics, however, an editorial in the Manchester Union Democrat newspaper of July 31st, 1866 must be mentioned. It lambasted the appointment of Daniel Clark to the judgeship. It claimed that Clark had ferociously supported radical positions opposed by President Andrew Johnson, who was the one that appointed him as a U.S. District Court judge. Johnson wanted the judgeship to go only to his friends, as he was telling everybody in Washington. The paper boldly stated that Clark had flip-flopped and voted for the president's program when he, and I quote, ready for this? When he snuffed the odor of patronage. They told it like it was in few words in those days. We're going to move on now. And back of me is what we know as a halfway house today. And it was originally the Calumet Club, built in 1895. The Calumet Club was a glorious, glorious structure. Most of us do not remember it because it was in the mid-60s, or 50s, excuse me, that it was downsized. So my memory goes back that far, but there are others here who obviously their memory does not go back that far. On March 16, 1895, the Manchester Union newspaper announced that the Calumet Clubhouse will be easily the finest in New Hampshire. The Calumet Club was founded in Manchester in November of 1887, the word Calumet meaning pipe of peace. An article in the Manchester Union newspaper on its 60th anniversary, dated November 18, 1947, said the membership was made up of businessmen, not wealthy men. That was not necessarily true if you look over the membership. It may have started that way, but it didn't evolve that way. William Butterfield, the Manchester architect, was the one who designed the building. It consisted of a dining room, library, and card room on the first floor, 3 bowling alleys in the basement, and a ballroom on the second floor. In fact, there was a lot more to it than that. There were billiard rooms, because I distinctly remember losing a game of pool to my father there, and that was the most mortifying night of my life. In 1946, Jacob Green Silly erected a home on this very site, to give you its history. In 1871, it was sold to William Johnson, his family in turn selling the home to the Calumet Club. It is possible that a Calumet Club may have moved that home to the right rear of the property. And after years and years of the club flourishing, finally in the mid-50s it was downsized. And in 1964, after 3/4 of a century as a men's club, it was sold to the Catholic Diocese of Manchester. As you know, it's not that now. It's a halfway house. I think they were just in the paper. Yeah, there was an article in the paper about somebody who had escaped and then was didn't do any harm, and then they caught him, and now he's back there. So thank you. We're going to move on to the next one.
Representing women here. Carrie Chapman Catt, president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, spoke here in March of 1902. Her subject, women's suffrage. The daughter of Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, was a guest here in March of 1896. The Calumet Club pioneered in welcoming of women. Although not members, they were active in social functions. Admiral Dewey was a guest in 1914 and made an honorary member.
The home in back of us was the home of Hervey Tufts at 136 Lowell Street. Hervey Tufts was a stove merchant, and he bought the land for this house from the Amiskay on February 1st, 1844. By 1846, he had erected a residence here. In 1849, he sold the house to Walter Adriance, a hardware merchant and the cousin of John B. Varick. Adriance added a west wing. In the early 1860s, a minister lived here, soon being transferred out of state, and then a druggist, whose unexpected death resulted in the sale of the house in 1867 to Person Cheney, a paper manufacturer and prominent Republican. Mr. Cheney lived here until 1888, and during that period, essentially 21 years, he served as mayor of Manchester in 1871, governor of New Hampshire in 1875 to 1877, and he was appointed as a Republican to the United States Senate in 1886 to fill a vacant seat. So you can see that the neighborhood that we're in today really had some people that moved up in the world and put Manchester's name on the map. During Cheney's ownership, the house underwent extensive changes. 2 maze rooms were added, bay windows in the dining room, and numerous other changes. He moved in 1888 to the Ezekiel Straw Mansion. And if you know where that is, it's opposite the Masonic Temple on Temple Place. And at that time, it encompassed the entire block from Elm to Chestnut and Brook to Harrison Streets. And you will see in today's tour that there are 2 themes that seem to recur. One of them is that this was actually a launching pad, the area that we're doing today, for people who became very successful and who moved out of the neighborhood as Manchester moved in a northward direction, and they all built mansions to live in. So the simple houses that you'll see in the tour today were really launching pads, but it was an elegant, elegant neighborhood in its day. The 1888 sale, however, was to Thomas Rice Varick, son of John B. Varick, the owner of the Varick hardware store. Thomas Rice Varick lived here until his death in 1935. He's best known today for funding the building of an athletic complex on the site of the Beach Street grounds, the current site of Gill Stadium. It was renamed Varick Park and used as such until 1913,
when it was rebuilt and called Textile Field. Then in 1927, Varick purchased the new Manchester House Hotel at 32 Merrimack Street and renamed it the Rice Varick Hotel. From 1935 until 1967, two different rectors of Grace Episcopal Church lived in this house. In the early 1970s, it became the Bradford Young Halfway House, and then it was known as Friendship House. In 2012, it was dedicated as a home for congregate living under the ownership of Friends and Families in Transition. It is worth noting that both this home, the residence of Governor Cheney, and the Ezekiel Straw home, the residence of Governor Straw, are both owned today by nonprofits to serve people in need. Families in Transition owns this home, and Mayor Works of Southern New Hampshire owns the Straw Mansion. On June 13, 1867, the Manchester Mirror newspaper announced that a new Catholic church would be built this season. Two prominent Manchester contractors were chosen: Hylas Dickey for the brickwork and Alpheus Gay for the wood. Hylas Dickey was also the Hylas Dickey home became the boys club at the corner of Beach and Hanover in later years.
Excuse me, he's just trying to get out of the parking spot. He wants to
Excuse me?
He wants to leave. Can we open it up?
I'm learning something.
On the feast day of St. Joseph, April 19, 1869, St. Joseph's Church was dedicated. It was not a cathedral at that time. In late 1869, construction of an 86-foot addition to the eastern end of the church began with the addition of a chapel. During construction, 3 new altars were added and new stained glass windows that are still there today. On December 5, 1892, the cathedral became the official name of St. Joseph's Church. On April 19, 1894, the St. Joseph Cathedral was consecrated. Okay, now we're going to... Yeah. This is the home of William Hartshorn. It was built in 1846 by William Hartshorn, the principal owner of the firm that sold stoves, both for cooking and heating and tin and copperware. His shop made and sent out a greater amount of tin, copper, brass, and sheet and cast iron than almost any other in the state. Now, you're going to see in today's tour, you're going to hear 2 or 3 or 4 names all mentioned that have to do with brass and copper and stoves and cast iron fittings and cast iron made to order. It's really important you understand that how Manchester developed was dependent upon cast iron stoves, both heating stoves and actually kitchen ranges, because the early 19th century and the period that we're talking about was the golden age of stoves, of cast iron stoves. And I recommend that you look at a book, a 1951 book by Josephine H. Pierce called Fire of the Hearth, The Evolution of the Heating Stove, and it's on Google Books if you're at all interested. There's a stove actually of a couple of Manchester cast iron stoves in this book. But Manchester was able to develop partly because it developed during the golden age of cast iron stoves. The house was built in 1846 by William Hartshorn, as I've said. In 1850, with Henry Dowling, he established the brass foundry on Manchester Street that was later to flourish under the ownership of David Varney. And the reason that it flourished was because William Hartshorn's father, Daniel, as early as 1842, in Amherst on Foundry Street, opposite the bank in those days, as early as 1841, established a foundry. He made the cast iron. He taught his son William the whole art of cast iron stoves, and he was the one that sent him to Manchester and his son Whittam, whose house this is in back of us, sold them on Elm Street as early as 1842, according to an ad in the Manchester Messenger newspaper. So I think that's important. William Hodgson was as well a member of the City Council and for 2 years represented Ward 3 in the state legislature. We'll have more to say about this business when we come to the Varney house later on the tour. Now, this is equally important. The house is also often referred to as the home of L. Melville French, a very important person in the history of this city, a doctor. This is despite the fact that he was not the original owner. This is the story. 3 houses away at Lowell and Union, just east of us, at Lowell and Union, was the imposing mansion of Aretas Blood. And when we get opposite that, we're going to show you a picture of this mansion. He was the wealthiest man in the city, but Dr. French married his daughter to be known as Emma Blood French in 1887. They built the villa, Riverside, on River Road, later called the Fuller Estate and known today as the Riverside Apartments. This is the first of several homes on today's tour which served as a springboard for its owners to upsize by building some of the most imposing estates in the city's history. Emma Blood French became a philanthropist. She built and endowed the Manchester Institute of Arts and Sciences, now called the New Hampshire Institute of Art, on Concord Street. She also donated the maternity and children's ward at the Elliott Hospital. In 1918, she built and endowed the L. Melville French Children's Ward that later was called the French Wing. The Manchester City Library was erected in memory of Emma's sister Eleanora Blood Carpenter, who will be mentioned again in this tour.
Okay, I have the color commentary here. Anyone a cat lover here? Yes. Okay, so you want to hear this. On February 5th, 1886, a historical event in the history of Manchester took place in this house. Dr. L. Melville French, who lived here at that time, had a photograph of his cat taken. This was the first time in city history of that being done. The cat's name was Zeb. All right. Benjamin and Eliza Kinsley home, 146 Lowell Street. It was built about 1846. Benjamin and Eliza Kinsley arrived in Manchester in 1840. Mr. Kinsley found work in the Ambuscade machine shop and was later promoted to timekeeper in that shop. He served as an alderman under Mayor Jacob James from 1847 to 1848, a charter member of Manchester Athenaeum, today the City Library. Mr. Kinsley was an active and outspoken member of the anti-slavery movement and the Underground Railroad that helped escaped slaves with passage to Canada. Here is a very real possibility that this home was used for that purpose of sheltering escaped slaves on their journey to Canada. Mrs. Kinsley was one of the most active temperance workers in the history of the city of Manchester. She was one of the founders of the WCTU Women's Christian Temperance Union in Manchester. She was on the committee when a petition was drawn up and signed by 3,000 Manchester women. I guess I'm representing women today with my speaking. And presented to the mayor and aldermen to close the saloons. Wait a minute. In Manchester. Mrs. Kinsley and others would visit. They called it a crusade saloons and speak to the proprietors about giving up the liquor trade. It was through her efforts that Manchester's first police matron was hired to separate the women from the men prisoners. In February of 1897, Mrs. Kinsley wrote a paper entitled, this is the quote, this is the title, ready? The Moral Condition of the City of Manchester. In opening, she alluded to the hundreds of saloons. Manchester's, quote, gambling hells, end quote, and, quote, houses of assignation. That means a love tryst. Tryst? How do you say that? Tryst. Better not to know. Better not to know. Yeah, hi, husband over there. Usually in a bad sense. She said there was no need of patronizing a liquor-selling grocery store. Mrs. Kinsley concluded by saying most women are willing to listen to the latest scientific facts with regard to alcohol on cooking. Okay, so now we're back to St. Joseph's, and we're at the St. Joseph's Rectory, which is at 145 Lowell Street. It was built in 1885. In June of 1884, Dennis M. Bradley was made bishop, yeah, little typo there, bishop of the newly created Diocese of Manchester, New Hampshire. This building was to serve as its new headquarters. Oh, there we go. In February of 1885, the Manchester Mirror newspaper announced that Bishop Bradley's new house was under construction on Lowell Street. Bishop Bradley's new house had 57 rooms in it. Wow. A chapel, a library, a study room, 2 large dining rooms, a large kitchen, a pantry, a laundry room, and a bathroom in the basement. A large boiler to service the 45 radiators throughout the building. The new building will be occupied by its worthy owner and its attendants and will be a credit to Manchester. On October 8, 1839, a man named O.W. Bailey bought this lot. It was the first private lot sold in the Amoskeag land sale. When St. Joseph's was enlarged, one of the homes where the chapel stands today was moved to Amherst Street, and in 1892 became the Sacred Heart Hospital. We're going to do the William Lark. Right, everyone ready? This is the William C. Lark House, 554 Union Street, and it was built in 1846. William C. Oh, it's not. It's William C. Clark, not Lark's. Correction. William C. Clark, who built the house, was the Attorney General of the state of New Hampshire. About 1854, the home was sold to William A. Putney, an popular Manchester dry goods dealer. After a few years, the house was bought by David Perkins, the principal of the school at Lowell and Chestnut Street. In December of 1868, Reverend John O'Brien, the first pastor of St. Joseph's Church, bought the home from David Perkins for $8,000. In 1884, the house was moved to its present site so the new home for Bishop Bradley could be built. Everyone also knows about the Bishop Bradley School, I'm sure, that is from the area. In 1909, the Cathedral Library took over the building. The girls from St. Joseph's High School occupied the home for a number of years. The date, 1909, which is on the top right of the building, is when the library took over the building. The date, 1867, which is on the top left, should read 1860, what? 68. That is when Father O'Brien bought the building.
In back of me, you're going to see an apartment building. As you can see, it occupies quite a bit of space. It was indeed the home of Aretas Blood. Aretas Blood was beyond question one of the wealthiest men in the city, if not the wealthiest man, and in the state. He was a grand man, and at the peak of his career, out of gratitude, for instance, this is true story, out of gratitude to a railroad in the West that was having a hard time financially, he lent them around $10 or $15 million just to repay them because they had bought some locomotives from him when he was having a hard time financially, just to give you an idea of the ethics of the day. Arias Blood was a man who made his fortune in the Manchester Locomotive Works, and also in steam engines as well, and the steam fire engines in the later 19th century. He was extremely successful. He was a great investor. He had large real estate holdings in Manchester. However, I just want to say this, that in today's tour, we have 3 or 4 or 5, maybe even 7 people, all of whom married the girl next door. So when I was doing this tour, a song came back to me from 1954 album, a Capitol album, that I happen to still own, and I played on my 33 RPM. Those of you who know what RPMs is, don't tell the others, it's a secret. Right? And I played it, and the name of the title is, How Can I Ignore the Girl Next Door? I Love Her More Than I Can Say. And that was a song that the people, some of the men in this neighborhood could have well sung, and maybe the lyrics were written in their mind years and years and years ago, and have passed down through the generations to this song that Frank Sinatra sang. Because we're going to see that the man next door, in this one case, L. Melville French, married one of the daughters of Arias Blood. And as we proceed on the tour, we're going to find others who married the other daughter, and we're going to find still others. So that's why I wanted to stop briefly and show you that this home, you can see the magnificent picture, is probably the focal point of this entire neighborhood.
You aren't going to sing to us, Dick?
She wants me to sing to her.
Catholic Church at 158 Lowell Street. This may be why they called it this after the last story. The Church of Our Lady of Perpetual Help was dedicated October 18th, 1908 by Bishop Soder Ortinsky of Philadelphia. The bishop, wearing his coronet and carrying his crozier, hope I said that right, staff, blessed the people. The land and the parish house were bought in January of 1908.
A picture of the owner of this home, Ebenezer Farron, is being shown as I talk. The picture was when he was older and toward the end of his life, but I've seen pictures when he was a younger man, and he was a very, very strong individual, as he would have to be, as you hear what I'm about to tell you. Eben Farron, called Eben, his full name was Ebenezer. Eben Farron bought this house at 52 Walnut Street from John R. Chandler in 1863. The home having been built in 1885 by Chandler, who was an overseer in the mills. Farron lived here until his death in 1902. He began his colorful career as a peddler. His habit was to carry 2 large tin trunks supported by straps over his shoulders. These were filled with portable goods calculated to appeal to the taste of the people among whom he traveled beginning in May 1837. This continued until 1845, when he erected the Farron Building on Elm Street. The Farron Building is still there today. I can only identify it by saying at one time it was called Joe Kelly's. If you know where that was on Elm Street. I don't know what it's called today. The business has changed so quick on Elm Street, I can't keep track of them. This continued until 1845, as I said, when he erected the Farron Building. It was where he conducted his dry goods and carpeting business. It was so successful that he was able to retire 20 years later in 1865. The building still stands on Elm Street today, 172 years after it was built. I brought with me today one of the coin silver spoons that he actually sold. It has his name, E. Farron, on where the maker's mark would be on the back of the spoon. He wasn't the silversmith that made the spoon, but he sold them. And this is a spoon right here. This spoon on the back of it, almost big enough to take stuffing out of a turkey. This spoon on the back of it says clearly with my microscopic eyesight, it says E. Fern. You can see that.
I can see that.
Thank you. She verified that.
Diane, hold it up so they can get a good picture of it.
Mr. Farron, on his mother's side, was a descendant of the Eden family who arrived in America on the Mayflower. He also claimed to have seen in a vision the exact site of the crucifixion of Christ, and often related from that day forward he had become a believer. He was as well an ardent prohibitionist. The house we're looking at, is it okay? The house we were looking at 60 Walnut Street was built about 1851. It was the home of Mace Moulton. Mace Moulton was an early resident of the Piscataqua section of Bedford before it was annexed to Manchester in 1853, settling there about 1817. He served as a deputy sheriff of Hillsborough County from 1817 until 1840 when he was elected high sheriff. He served in that office until 1844 when he resigned and was elected to the U.S. Congress. So there's another person that put Manchester on the map in Washington. In 1847, on his return from Washington, he was elected a member of the Governor's Council, serving for 2 years. He moved to Manchester in 1849 when he was again elected deputy sheriff. He was a director of the Amherst Bank and president of the Amherst Savings Bank, which position he held at the time of his death in 1867. Now, the second owner of this home was Charles E. Balch, the cashier of the Manchester National Bank and the treasurer of the Manchester Savings Bank. He built the mansion that still stands today at the southeast corner of Elm and North Street. His widow left money in her will to build the Balch Hospital for Children. So there's another person who used Walnut Street as a launching pad, who worked hard and moved northward where he lived in a mansion. This neighborhood has a feel about it that has grown on me, and I hope it begins to grow on you today.
I add something.
In 1916, the owner of this house, Martin Fitzgerald, who sold cemetery monuments, granddaughter married a man from Indiana, an automobile manufacturer who was twice her age. The two local newspapers, the Manchester Mirror and the Manchester Union, had a field day with this story. But what did that matter? The man was worth $13 million.
Wow. A lot of money then and now.
So,
And women's rights just.
I
all right. It was this home that got me interested in this block because it's where Frank Carpenter lived before he built the Carpenter house. It's funny how we go back and we stop at mansions and what did the person do earlier? You know, and that's what really whetted my interest in this whole street. The first owner of 61 Walnut Street was Asa Trask, a boot and shoe dealer who lived here in 1852. But by 1869, Samuel C. Merrill, a well-to-do coffee and spice merchant, lived here. And being passed around is an ad that shows that Samuel C. Merrill ran what was in those days called a spice factory. In those days, everything had to be cooked. Nuts had to be cooked, coffee had to be roasted, and the various spices all needed to be processed. They weren't multinational corporations, I can assure you, in that period of time, owned by conglomerates that were sustained by hedge funds. That did not happen in this period, if you hadn't already guessed that.
So it was called a spice factory, and Samuel C. Merrill had about 3 different locations in Manchester where he conducted his business. He was the one that lived here. Now enter the young 24-year-old Frank Carpenter, who was listed in 1869, as a boarder at this very home. Now, the word boarder in those days meant something different. The directories, if a son or daughter was living with their parents and the son or daughter was, say, 22 or 21, he would still be listed as a boarder. Today, it's not popular to call your children boarders. But if you analyze it a little bit more, maybe they are boarders. But in fact, he was much more than that. He was the brother. He wasn't a brother. He was one of the relatives of Samuel Merrill's wife, Clara. The rest of the talk in this home will be on the early life of Frank P. Carpenter in Manchester, since he was to become the city's greatest philanthropist. Little has been mentioned by historians of his early life before moving from Walnut Street, this home in back of us at 61, to his newly built mansion at Elm and North Streets in 1892. Frank Carpenter came to Manchester from Concord at the age of 19 and entered into the wholesale firm of J.S. Kidder & Company, wholesalers of flour, grain, cement, lime, and much more. For 5 years, he learned the trade and was listed as a bookkeeper there. In 1869, he left the firm and became the junior member of the firm of Drake & Carpenter, first located on Manchester Street, having bought out Samuel C. Merrill's coffee and spice business. But within a year, the business at this location abruptly ended when the Great Fire of July 1870 left this building and the entire north side of Manchester Street and much of the south side of Hanover Street in charred ruins. In fact, tragically, the fire originated in their business, when the hot coals of a coffee roaster had not been adequately extinguished. Drake testified at City Hall that they had, and he said these words, they had roasted 2 roasters of coffee and 1 of peanuts, and they poked back the fire and they let it down the floor, and he couldn't understand how there could have been a fire. But there were witnesses for the police department, and other neighbors saw the fire shooting out of that building, so there was little question. Their reports were damning. Drake and Carpenter moved to a new building at Granite and Franklin Street, and the wholesale flour and grain business flourished. Carpenter severed his connection to this business in 1885, buying out the Amoskeag paper mill at Canal and West Merrimack Streets, expanding it, and recapitalizing it with Aretas Blood as president and himself as treasurer. Aretas Blood, in fact, already became family to Frank Carpenter, Frank Carpenter, was courting Aretas' daughter. So there you have. How can I ignore? How did it go? The girl next door. Ahead of its time. I mean, this lyric goes back generations. It probably goes back centuries, don't you think? So, in fact, Aretas Blood had become family because he was courting Eleonora, who lived 3 houses away from this address at 61 Walnut Street, the girl next door, in a mansion at the corner of Walnut Street and Union, which I've shown you, long since torn down. In 1872, Frank and Eleanor became Mr. and Mrs. You will remember that earlier, when we were at 142 Lowell Street, we mentioned that Ella Melville French lived but 3 houses away from Emma Blood, who was to become his wife. So the moral of the story, I submit, is inescapable. If you want your sons to marry into wealth, then buy a house 3 houses away from a wealthy man who lives in a mansion and also has a marriageable daughter, and their future will be assured.
Have that printed on cards.
The house just north of where the flag is flying and the lot next to it, that is 73 Walnut Street. It's the home of David Varney, who assumed ownership of this house no later than, I would say, 1850. He was born in the Tuftonboro area in 1822
and learned the trade of machinist in Portsmouth in his late teens. At the age of 20, he went to work for the Ambuscade, worked his way up, and became superintendent of the locomotive department in 1854 at the still young age of 32. 3 years later, he associated with H.I. Dowling at the brass foundry and copper shop on Manchester Street. His partner died in 1869, Mr. Dowling, and Mr. Varney conducted the business alone until his death in 1901. I'm just going to take a minute and say that Mr. Varney's success, both as mayor and his success in the brass and copper business on Manchester Street, the location of the soup kitchen where that is today, never would have happened without Daniel Hartshorn back in Amherst. Because it was Hartshorn and Hartshorn's money, his success, both father and son, that founded the foundry in its original, when it was originally purchased. It had been a steam mill that had burned down, but the chimney survived, and that's where they built their foundry. Again, it wouldn't have happened without Mr. Hartshorn. The political career of David Varney matches success as a businessman. He served as alderman for a term and as state representative and state senator, also for a term. He was mayor of the city in 1889 and 90, and during that period, the West Manchester Grammar School was erected and bore his name as the Varney School. A street is named after him as well. His last act as mayor was to acquire possession of the land of Stark Park for the city. It should be mentioned that as of 1880, nearly all the brass and copper used at the Manchester Locomotive Works was made at this foundry. Now, it's interesting that this was a tight little neighborhood. Mr. Varney lived here, Arias blood that owned the Locomotive Works lived down there. Could they have had coffee or some other kind of, enjoyable beverage later in the day and discuss business over a cup of tea or some other beverage? It's possible. But it was a tight little neighborhood. This house, too, became a launching pad for Mr. Varney to move in 1871 to a mansion in the ever-expanding city of Manchester. He moved to the mansion that still stands today at the corner of Maple and Myrtle Streets. But for over 60 years, the property was occupied the entire block. The house is still there, but Mr. Varney's property, when he was alive, occupied the entire block bordered by Maple, Myrtle, Ash, and Prospect Streets. Mr. Varney joined Dr. George Dana Town, whom we're going to talk about shortly, Frank Carpenter, Charles Balch, whom we just mentioned, Person Cheney, whom we've already visited, whose house we have visited, and Abraham Olzendam, whose house we have not yet visited, all on today's tour, whose success enabled them to upsize to homes of a baronial style. If this section of Walnut Street were to ever be renamed, Canaveral Street would be the fitting name, since no other section of the city serves as a launching pad, even coming close to it. The home you're looking at is at 170 Lowell Street. It was built in 1851. Frank A. Brown's ownership of this house dates to that year. 9 years earlier, however, on February 2nd, 1842, the Manchester Memorial newspaper that I'm lucky enough to own announced the following: Brown gave us a sitting for a daguerreotype miniature some days since. So many like the looks of it that we have not yet got possession of it. What is a daguerreotype? It was the first commercially successful photographic process in the history of photography. It swept the country. Frank A. Brown pioneered this new invention in Manchester, and his studio, advertised almost daily in the newspapers, made him a good living, since daguerreotypes were expensive. Each image was on a silvered copper plate, was fragile, and was sold inserted in a locket or a case. A later 19th century owner of this property was Dr. George Dana Town. He was a surgeon at the Elliott Hospital. He also had the distinction of being the medical examiner for 15 different life insurance companies, if that's a distinction. His marriage to Elizabeth French Means in 1904 vaulted him from this house to the magnificent estate in the North End, renamed the Town Estate, after he became master of the house. We will refer to Elizabeth and her first husband, Charles Tracy Means, and this estate later in today's tour.
W. Stevens, who designed the Ash Street School and many of the Amoskeag Mill buildings. Joseph Bennett was another pioneer in Manchester, arriving here in 1844. We'll let the policeman drive by. Hi. To work for the J.T.P. Hunt, the first contractor for the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. In 1843, he graduated from Yale University. He taught school in Manchester at the Piscataquag, Hallsville, and the North and South Grammar Schools. In 1860, he entered the brick-making and laying business, a trade that he learned as a boy. He served as an alderman of the city in 1849 from Ward 5. In 1865, he was elected as the city clerk of Manchester, serving until 1876. In 1868, he was elected trustee of the Amoskeag Bank. He was an original trustee of the Elliott Hospital and superintendent of the construction of the hospital building. He had charge of the mason work at the time of the building of the First Baptist Church in 1873 at the corner of Concord and Union Streets, and served as director and treasurer of that society for many years. He took a prominent part in Masonry. He was a master of the Lafayette Lodge, treasurer for 23 years, and recorder of the Trinity Commandery for 25 years. In December of 1890, he was presented with a Master Jewel. Thank you.
Can you switch that to me?
Do I do the Octagon House?
No. No, that's not yet. This one's next. It's out of order.
Okay. Yeah, I
you
can.
be invasive with me.
Jeez.
At least you don't have to stick it back in his pocket.
Yeah, really. I was pushing it.
So she's pushing it with you, so I thought I'd push it.
You've been tagged.
This way.
Uh,
Wait a minute.
You do better on this collar.
Yeah, you're right.
Pointing away
You're
from
right.
There we go.
Yes, broadcaster.
That's why we keep the extra.
I know.
That's why. That's a big
Now we're going to be moving up here. Please follow us around the corner. You don't believe this puritanical newspaper press baloney. You buy into Puritanism. That's your thing. I mean, the puritanical days are done. We're living in the real world now. Yeah. Now, we can stop here so she can get a picture from across the street of this home. Kirsten, where are you? Yeah, move down further and we'll get a...
No standing on Beach Street. This would be too dangerous.
Hard, you won't be able to see it coming down.
She's coming.
Yeah.
Dick, where would you like?
You want to get out of the street, everybody, because the cars come down, barreling down here, and we don't know what the limits are on the insurance. Now, in back of me is the home of Dr. William Whittier Brown. Dr. Brown came to Manchester in 1846 as one of the early physicians of the city. In 1869, 5 years before his death, he served as president of the New Hampshire Medical Society. He was one of the most skilled and highly thought out physicians in New Hampshire. Dartmouth College conferred upon him the honorary degree of Master of Arts in recognition of his professional ability. In 1849 and 50, he was in California practicing his profession, but he returned with a handsome amount of money, it's written, which he invested in Manchester real estate. He erected the Brown Block on Elm Street 80 by 62 feet, 3 stories high, made of brick with granite trimmings. It was on the west side of Elm, and it was opposite what was then called Monument Square. Today it's Victory Common, and it ran between Pleasant Street and West Central Street, which of course is no longer there because of the center of New Hampshire. Dr. Brown is best known, however, even to this day, as the surgeon of the 7th New Hampshire Volunteers in the Civil War. He entered the service in 1861 and was discharged for disability in 1864. You see, when he returned from California in 1850, the Panama Canal not having been built yet, you had to traverse Panama. And he had an attack of yellow fever, as literally hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans did that went to the gold rush. And he was to suffer from that yellow fever for the rest of his days. In January 1868, he was one of the 10 founding members of the Louis Bell Post No. 3 GAR, or Grand Army of the Republic. Just as we have Sweeney Post No. 2 today for the Civil War, we had Louis Bell Post No. 3, Grand Army of the Republic. For 4 years, it occupied a hall in his block on the top floor. In 1881, the Sons of the Union Veterans was formed. The GAR, the Grand Army, the veterans knew they were getting older, and there was a desire to perpetuate into the future the patriotic reverence that was held for all the wives that had fought for the preservation of the Union. So in 1881, as I said, the Sons of the Union Veterans was formed, and the very first of nearly 100 camps in New Hampshire was the W.W. Brown Camp No. 1. So there we have Camp No. 1, Sweeney Post No. 2, and Louis Bell Post No. 3, if you can memorize all that, right? It has the distinction of being the only camp in New Hampshire or Massachusetts that has met continuously from 1881 to this very day. It meets still here today in Manchester monthly on a Monday evening from 6:30 until 8 o'clock. The fraternal organization dedicated to preserving the history and legacy of heroes who fought and worked to save the Union. It was chartered by Congress in 1954. It is still, it is today the legal successor to the Grand Army of the Republic. In 1916, at his grave in the Valley Cemetery, a dedication was held by the W.W. Brown No. 1 encampment, and a flagpole was erected. Even today, a service is still carried out by the encampment, and it was carried out on Flag Day. I was there this year, as were 4 or 5 others, because W.W. Brown Camp No. 1 still survives. Dr. Brown served as the director of the Merrimack River Savings Bank, was a member of the Franklin Street Congregational Church, and served as president of the trustees in 1855, 67, and 68. His death occurred in 1874. He survived all of his children, all 7 in number, 2 sons being soldiers in the war. He lost all 7 of his children. It was his widow, Martha, who first conceived the idea for a Protestant orphanage. That may seem funny to you today, but there were Irish orphanages, French orphanages, and also Protestant orphanages in those days. That Protestant orphanage, which was dedicated in 1893, still bears a tablet, which and on July 9, 1898, the tablet was unveiled. The tablet is still there today. And it reads, in memoriam, Martha W. Brown, first president and benefactress, 1898, in Roman numerals. In August 1897, Mrs. Brown willed $26,000 to the home. Today, that is the Webster House.
It opened as one of the first residents. He was 5 years old. My great-grandparents had come here, and shortly after arriving, my great-grandfather died at 37 of black lung disease. And my great-grandmother had to work. So my grandfather was raised at the Webster House. She'd pick him up on Saturday afternoon after her half day of work, come home for Saturday night, and Sunday afternoon she'd bring him back to the Webster House. So I'm part of the legacy to carry on, because that's what we do in Manchester.
It is.
My grandpa was at YDC.
The Octagon House, for those of you that paid attention in your geometry class, this is at 585 Beach Street. The house was built about 1855 by the Reverend William Richardson. It was one of only two left in Manchester, the other being at the corner of Hanover and Belmont Street. The brick used in its construction were made at a brook which ran by Union and Bridge Street. For many years, the building has attracted sightseers because of its quaint architecture. And as you can see, it's for sale.
584 Beach.
Right, 584 Beach. On March 22nd, 1880, a woman died of cancer in this house, 584 Beach Street. In her will, she left a sum of money to establish an institution that flourishes today. Okay, it's a test now. Name that woman. Does anyone have a guess?
Mary Elliott.
Very good. Mary Elliott, he's peeking over my shoulder. Mary Elliott, the widow of Dr. John Elliott. Thank you.
You're the one that started the hospital now. Yes.
This is 603, which is kind of neat number, considering we live in New Hampshire, but anyway. Alden W. Sanborn, 603 Beach Street. It was built about 1874. Alden W. Sanborn was one of the most successful carriage builders in Manchester. He started in the early 1850s, eventually building the three-story building at the northwest corner of Elm and Bridge Street for his manufacturing of carriages. In 1877, he moved to San Francisco. Yeah, okay, louder. In 1877, he moved to San Francisco, where he started in business there. The home was sold in the year he moved, 1877, to Stephen D. Green, a successful building contractor of many of the early homes in Manchester. At the time of his death in 1880, he was one of Manchester's wealthiest citizens and second largest real estate owner in the city. In 1916, the Stephen D. Green Gate was given in his memory at the Pine Street entrance to the Valley Cemetery.
And the home that we're talking about is not the corner house, but the one with a fire escape on the side. That's the Abraham Olzendam house at 92 Walnut Street. Abraham P. Olzendam learned the art of dyeing cloth in Prussia. Coming to Manchester, he engaged in the manufacturing of hosiery for men and boys, predominantly woolen socks. The business had sewing agents in Boston and New York, and his workforce increased from 60 employees in 1869 to 200 in 1890. From this home in 1871, he moved to a mansion that occupied an entire block, bordered by Beech, Coe, Ash, and Orange Street. Today it is the Maple Leaf Nursing Home. And the Ash Street Inn was built for his son. So once again, Canaro Street. Remember that now. In 1855, at 605 Union Street in back of us, George French was living in this home. George A. French, both an attorney and an insurance agent that was in the insurance business where he made his mark, rising in his field to become special agent for the New England states for the Hanover Insurance Company of New York. In 1852, he was elected city clerk, holding that position for 4 years, and he was as well the warden of Grace Episcopal Church. His daughter, Elizabeth, was raised in this house. As a teenager, she met Charles Tracy Means, barely 20, and living but a block away. How can I ignore the girl next door, he said to himself. And he lived in the parking lot, which is now the parking lot for the funeral home, the Bruford Funeral Home. That was a house where he was living as a boarder. Actually, his father was very wealthy, but he was learning the trade. As a teenager, she met him, barely 20. In 1883, 3 years later, the couple exchanged marriage vows. How did that happen? I say because he could not ignore the girl next door. His father, William G. Means, was a principal in the Manchester Locomotive Works. Charles was to become paymaster of the company, inherit his father's fortune, and build the Means estate in 1897 on the southern half of the block I described at the beginning of this talk. It encompassed the entire southern half of the block, as I said, bordered by Elm, Carpenter, Chesson, Trenton Streets. Elizabeth, born in the home before us, was to live in splendor in her new home, a spacious mansion cared for by 4 domestic servants. So you might say, another family that used this neighborhood as a washing pad. We'll have to rename this section too. In the 20th century, Dr. J. Franklin Robinson lived here for over 30 years, but in 1951 it was bought by the Lizotte family and converted into the Lizotte Convalescent Home. Today's city records listed as a boarding house.
23 Union Street of James P. Straw. He was the brother of Ezekiel Straw. The first owner of this house, built about 1855, was Charles A. Putney. He was a dry goods merchant, and little is known of him other than his wife divorced him in 1871. James B. Straw was the owner of this house from 1864 to his death in January of 1894. He was Manchester's first city auditor, and earlier has served as tax collector in 1856, as well as 2 terms as alderman. He did not believe that the city had a right to vote away its money for anything other than clearly defined objects. He was strict, even questioning the brass buttons on police uniforms as an extravagance. But his place in history is sealed by the die-hard abolitionist passions he felt as a young man. This is a true story of how these passions played out. Mr. Harrington was mayor in 1859, the year they hanged abolitionist John Brown. City auditor James B. Straw was also an abolitionist who felt Brown's fate so keenly that he thought it would be a good idea to toll the City Hall bell when the Harper's Ferry raider met his fate. Mr. Straw made his way up to the belfry and started to toll the bell. Mayor Harrington heard the bell from his saloon, located in the basement of the building across the way, and rushed up into the belfry, where he threatened to throw Mr. Straw downstairs if he didn't go peacefully, and some of Mr. Straw's friends persuaded him to go quietly.
I just want to add that if you hold up this photo, there's a very, very, very famous illustration that shows both Mr. Harrington and James B. Straw in the Belfry. It's called the Battle of the Belfry. And the sentiments dealing with abolition were so strong in those days that this merited this kind of a drawing. It's very, very famous. And if you have a chance, come by and we'll show it to you.
In Union Street, it's the home of John A. Perry, built about 1852. When the house was built, there were very few houses on Union Street or east or north of it. John A. Perry was one of the very first druggists in the city of Manchester. It appears that he lived in the house for a very short time. The home was built in 1853 or 1854 by William P. Newell, who lived in the house until his death in 1885. William P. Newell was one of the pioneers in Manchester, arriving here in 1837 to accept the agency tendered to him by the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. He was in charge of the island mills or bell mills just below the Amoskeag Dam. At that time, there were no mills constructed on the east side of the Merrimack River. The first one to be constructed was the No. 1 Stark Mill 1 year later in 1838. In 1846, he assumed the agency of the Manchester Mills and continued in that position until he resigned in 1873. He served as a director and president of the Manchester Savings Bank at the time of its organization in 1846. He served as one of the first water commissioners. He was an original trustee of the city library. He served as an alderman from 1848 to 1849 and 1868 to 1869. He was a member of the Governor's Council when Ezekiel A. Straw was governor and an original member of the Amoskeag Veterans.
We'd like you to listen closely to what we have to say next. One part of it is a very crucial part of Manchester history.
What we're sharing with you now is something that is little known. I doubt there's one person here that knows any of this other than John and myself. Before what we know as downtown Manchester was developed, what was known as the center, Manchester Center, which is right where Massapequa and Mammoth Road, and south of that to Hughes Road, where that section was. The center on Mammoth Road in the area of the old cemetery is where the first city government met. People living in that area who wanted to go fishing in Amoskeag Falls took what was called the Old Falls Road to get to their destination. The road ran through a couple of houses we've done on this tour. The first one was the Frank A. Brown House, 170 Walnut Street. You remember that home. It ran through that house, and it also ran through this house, the William Newell House. Continued through Tremont Common, now known as Pulaski Park, and the parking lot for the Buford Funeral Home, continuing to where the Masonic Temple and post-79 American Legion stand today, and then to the Amoskeag Falls. But that's little known information. What is hardly known at all is this. Why was the name Union Street chosen for Union Street, when all the streets running north and south are named after trees? Pine, chestnut, elm, walnut, ash, and maple. Well, when Union Street was laid out, it crossed the Old Falls Road at this house. This was considered such a historic event that the city decided and considered that at that point a union took place between the old and the new. Hence the name Union Street. Thank you. The home in back of me, which is at 81 Union Street, 581, excuse me, is the home of Horatio H. Ladd, L-A-D-D. Mr. Ladd was the first owner of this home and lived in it until his death. His trade was that of a jeweler, watchmaker, and silversmith. He died in this home in 1891. After 40 years in business, after 40 years in business. His silver spoons of coined silver, since sterling silver was in the future, are very, very collectible today. We brought one to show you. The maker's mark, H.H. Ladd, clearly identifies it. And it's being held up right now. The next house is this one here. This is the home of David Hill at 63 High Street. David Hill was the first owner of this house, living here from 1852 until about 1863. He was an early and successful insurance agent even before Manchester was incorporated as a city. It was Mr. Hill who insured Manchester's town hall, known as the Townhouse, for $10,000. It burned to the ground in 1844, and as far as we know, the amount was paid in full. He was clerk of the Common Council from 1846 to 49, and under two different mayors. The next owner, however, is the one we're going to focus on. John Weeks Moore, perhaps one of the most important people that ever lived in this city. It was a big, big, big surprise to learn that this man existed. He was a composer, he was an author, he was a teacher of music, and he was best known as the author of books, having published about 12 books. He was the author of Moore's Encyclopedia of Music, published in 1852. It can be best described by reading two sentences from the preface, and I quote, "It presents a view of the subject of music, elementary, technical, historical, biographical, vocal, and instrumental. I have given definitions and explanations of more than 5,000 technical terms. as well as a very full and comprehensive musical biography embracing a succinct memoir of more than 4,000 distinguished musical celebrities and composers. Now, that book is over 1,000 pages in length. It's in the library. It's in their vault. The fonts are so small that you have to almost have a magnifying glass to read them, or a 20/22 vision, and it makes the Bible seem like just a pamphlet. I've never seen anything like it. The man is absolutely amazing. In 1867, he wrote, "Never look back with your hand to the plow" for Walter Kittredge, the composer in 1863 of the best-known Civil War song, "Tending Tonight on the Old Campground." Mr. Moore was so emotionally distressed by the assassination of President Lincoln that he wrote a beautiful poem as a tribute to the great man. I will read you the first of the 7 stanzas. I will read you the first of the 7 stanzas. Mourn, lo, Columbia's guardian sleeps. Mourn, our chief, a nation for him weeps. Whilst in our hearts we raise a tomb, round which immortal wreaths shall bloom. Lincoln, the honest, good, and wise. Lincoln, translated to the skies.
This is a Joseph Kennard home at 15 High Street. It was built about 1855. Excuse me. Joseph Kennard came to Manchester in 1853. He opened a grocery store shortly after his arrival in Manchester. He invested in the lumber business, becoming one of the largest dealers in the state. He and his brothers were large real estate owners in Manchester. The name Kennard Road comes from a large acreage they owned in that area. They owned part of the Amoskeag Ledge. In the 1930s, the city wanted to fill in the ledge, but Nora, the daughter of Joseph, would not allow that to happen. Mr. Kennard, along with all of his investments, even found time to open a wine store on Elm Street. In 1892, the Kennard Block opened on the site of the present-day New Hampshire Plaza. It was the largest and finest business block in the state of New Hampshire, and one of the largest fires in Manchester history. It burned to the ground in 1902 with devastating losses to the occupants and the Kennard family. One tragic loss was an almost complete collection of the Rogers Group's almost 82 subjects in all.
I just want to thank all of you for your attention. We thank you for your patience. I hope you've enjoyed today's tour. We're grateful to the Manchester Historic Association for their help in making this possible, to the Research Library for their help in helping put this all together. We're grateful to John Clayton for his help in publicizing the tour. And we urge any and all of you to get involved in the Manchester Historic Association. And I'm going to turn this over to John Clayton for the final word.
An incredible collection of digitized photos that we share often on Facebook. So it's Milliard Museum. It can't be any simpler than that. 2 words, Milliard Museum. Do consider becoming a member. We receive no city, state, or federal funding. We are funded by memberships and by grants when we can get them. The more members, the more programs like this we can put on. If you've not been to the Milliard Museum, we'd love to see you there. It's a great resource Tuesday through Saturday from 10 to 4. So if you've got nothing going on now, you can always swing down to 200 Bedford Street and join us for the day. Again, many thanks to all of you. If you've got some friends who've never gone on one of our tours, tell 5 friends. That's all we know. Next time we'll get a bus. Right. Thank you all very much. Good day.